Hey, world history. Welcome to U2-L2 Intro to Egypt. Ancient Egypt, that is. So, heads up, this week is super ed puzzle heavy. Yeah, you're gonna learn really fast that I do like my ed puzzles. Luckily, these this week are fairly short. They're on the shorter side, so that's always good. So, your job today is anything in blue text is going to be a question that I want you to answer directly on the ed puzzle. Anything in red text is going to be an important concept on your study guide. And of course, if you have questions, please let me know. I am happy to help you out. Just another thing too, with definitions, make sure that you're not taking them from like Google or AI or anything like that. So, kind of my little shortcut that I give to y'all is that I post my slides in the Miss Corey's resource folder, and you can go into my slides and you can just copy and paste the definitions if you like, or if you want to write them in your own words, that's perfectly fine with me too. Whichever works best for you. So, learning targets describe the development, characteristics, and decline of civilizations in Egypt. So, here's my first question for you. When you hear the words ancient Egypt, what comes to mind? Yeah, these are just some of the things that might come to mind. So you might think of like Cleopatra because she's super famous and there's been some movies about her. Now, Cleopatra, yes, she is part of ancient Egypt, but she was actually a ruler during the Roman Empire. So we won't get to her quite yet just because that's more in like the Roman unit. Also, you might think of like mummies and sarcophaguses. Okay, those are all really big, kind of like iconic things about ancient Egypt. You might think of Hollywood movies like The Mummy. You might think of their artwork. You might think of the pyramids at Giza, or you might think of pharaohs like King Tut, who is very famous. All right, so first question, where is Egypt? So, Egypt is in the continent of Africa. Some consider it also to be part of the Middle East. So, you can see it right here in red. And then here's more of a zoomed in map of Egypt. So you can see here that it borders the Mediterranean Sea as well as the Red Sea. Today, there's something called the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, but that did not exist until more modern times. You can also see it's very close to places like Jerusalem and Israel, but also like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. So, yeah, a lot going on with Egypt. So we are not even going to begin to scratch the surface of ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt lasts about 3,000 years. Yeah, that's right, 3,000 years. So let's just put it in perspective, right? So last year, most of you took US history. You spend the whole year learning about roughly 500 years of US history. For ancient Egypt, in 2 weeks, we're going to go through about 3,000 years. That's a lot. We're missing a lot, and I feel bad about it. All right, so here's another thing that is going to make your life a lot easier when talking about ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt is broken into Upper and Lower Egypt. And you can see here on the map, you're like, wait a minute. Why is Upper Egypt like down here and Lower Egypt is up here? That doesn't seem to make sense. But you must think about the flow of the river. So Upper Egypt is upstream of the river, and Lower Egypt is downstream of the river. So the Nile River, which is the big famous river that flows through Egypt, um, it flows into the Mediterranean Sea. So it goes this direction. Okay, so it goes up. So you got to think of it like Upper Egypt is upstream, Lower Egypt is downstream. And kind of where it splits in half is about right here. So that's kind of like the border between Upper and Lower Egypt. All right, moving on. So let's talk about the landscape of Egypt. Now, of course, this does not include like all of Egypt, but this is the vast majority of it. So we talked about it's broken to Upper and Lower Egypt. Where the Nile River is called the Nile River Valley. And typically that land is very fertile, very lush, as you can see in this picture right here. Here's the Nile. You can see kind of all the trees. If it's not by the river, typically it is a desert. Okay, it looks like this. In northern Egypt, it has very flat plateaus, where southern Egypt, it has a lot of mountains like these that are a lot harder to pass. So here's kind of the time frame of ancient Egypt. So it's broken into all these little categories. So the first would be like the late pre-dynastic, that was from 3400 to 3000 BCE. Then the early dynastic period, which was 3000 to 2686. The Old Kingdom, which was from 2686 to 2160. Then the first intermediate period, which was 2160 to 2055. The Middle Kingdom, which is 2055 to 1650, the second intermediate period, 1700 to 1550 BCE, the New Kingdom, which was 1500 to 1069 BCE, the third intermediate period from 1069 to 715 BCE, the late period, which was 715 to 332 BCE, the Ptolemaic period, which was 332 to 30 BCE, and then finally the Roman period, which was from 30 BCE to 395 CE. Oh my gosh, there's so much. No, I don't expect you to ever memorize this. We're just going to focus on these three here. So we have the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. So another really important thing to learn about with ancient Egypt is dynasties. Now, dynasties does not is not just specific to ancient Egypt, but it is really important to ancient Egypt because what it means, it's a line of family rulers in a country or kingdom. So everyone ruling in a dynasty is related to the first person who started the dynasty. So, for example, here's the 23rd dynasty. Here's the first pharaoh. All these other pharaohs that come after him are in some way, shape, or form related to the first pharaoh. Okay, sometimes it's kind of a stretch if they're related. Like sometimes there's like adoptions or like marriages. But yeah, dynasties is always hereditary. Okay. And if a new family line comes in, so let's say some dude that was not related to any of these guys came in, that dude would start a new dynasty. And there are 33 Egyptian dynasties in all. Ooh, here's another good question. What is the difference between monotheistic and polytheistic? Yeah, so mono means one, and that means that people in the religion only worship one God. So a good example of that would be like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Poly means many. So that means people in the religion worship many gods. For example, we have ancient Egypt, and we also have ancient Greece. Those would be two big examples. So, a pharaoh. I know you probably all have heard that word before. So, a pharaoh is a person who is the head of Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, or both at the same time. Okay. So, the Egyptian word that a lot of ancient Egyptian historians use would be like Nezubit. That is like what the people in Egypt would call their pharaohs like 3,000 years ago. Historians might also use the word king instead of pharaoh. So pharaoh is more of like a English westernized word. So the pharaoh is also believed to be a reincarnation of Horus, who is the god of kingship in the sky. If you ever see pictures of pharaohs with like these hats on that have like the blue and the gold stripes, so the hat is called a nemes. And then typically you'll see pharaohs with beards. No, typically those beards were actually not real. They were fake. They were made out of like animal hair. And then they also would wear these kilts as well. And there's the word for what the kilts are. I can't pronounce that well. I'm sorry. Okay, so if a pharaoh is the reincarnation of the god Horus, not only would they have the role of politically ruling Egypt, but what other role? Yeah, that's right, religion, right? Because they're a reincarnation of a god. So they're probably going to have to do something with religion. So a pharaoh is also in charge of overseeing religion, or at least playing the role in ceremonies and stuff like that. There's also high priests that would do a lot of the work. Pharaohs would also enact laws, collect taxes. They were the commander in chief of the military, and they were also seen to maintain ma'at. And you're probably like, what is ma'at? So means order. So it pretty much means like the order of the universe, to have balance and to have justice throughout Egypt. But it can also be used for evil, such as going to war. So, how do historians know mostly the exact dates and timeline of ancient Egypt? That's a really good question. It's hard to date things going back to 3000 BCE, but there is this really special find, and it's called the King's List. And here's a picture of it up here. You can see it's very fragmented. But what it is an inscription on a temple that was the temple of Pharaoh Seti I, and it was made in about 1290 BCE, and it listed the 75 predecessors before him in chronological order. So it's pretty much a map of who was who before Pharaoh Seti I. Again, it is very fragmented, so some of the names are missing or they're just guesses. And it also includes ruling gods from the times before humans. That goes into more Egyptian mythology. All right, so let's talk about how did ancient Egypt get its start. So there's been pre-human activity in the Nile Valley since about 700,000 BCE, and then between 5,400 and 3,400 BCE, people shifted to agriculture. I know we talked about this in Unit 1. So that shift to agriculture would include things like fishing, herding sheep, herding goats, growing wheat and barley, but also making irrigation canals for the flooding that the Nile would like flood, and then you need the irrigation canals to like, you know, make sure they don't flood the cities, but also irrigation canals to water the crops. And then when the Nile floods, it usually leaves behind silt, which we talked about in Unit 1 was really good for farming. There's also social and political power that started to develop during this time. So the more wealth someone would have meant that they had the more power. So before ancient Egypt was unified into like one kingdom, ancient Egypt was split up into city states. So city states are cities that rule itself. So no other larger country or kingdom rules it. It's just kind of its own freestanding city. Okay. And it also serves as a cultural, religious, and economic center. So each city state typically had a main god that they worshipped. And Egyptian city states traded with places as far as Afghanistan. So just to put that in perspective, here's Egypt right here. So they would get traded goods all the way from Afghanistan, which is right over here. So, how do historians find Egyptian artwork, jewelry, inscriptions, and other cultural pieces? Yeah. Some of you might be surprised by this, but it kind of makes sense, right? Graves, which is always kind of a controversial thing. Like, should you be digging up dead bodies? But there are some really interesting things in there. So, graves are really good for preservation because they're buried in the ground. Okay. They're also very well marked because they usually have like tombstones or some sort of inscriptions. So, in graves, archaeologists have found copper all the way from Palestine. So again, here's Egypt. Palestine's right up here. They also found lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. So that's really far because that's like all the way over here. And they also have tomb inscriptions describing battles with the Amu people. And the Amu people were people from Asia. All right, let's leave that here. So, wrap up. Today we learned about dynasties, monotheism, polytheism, pharaoh, the king's list, and city states. Next up, you're going to do U2-L3, Old Kingdom. If you have questions, comments, want to learn more, you can let me know. There's also the optional weekly check-in for this week. So yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.